Hiya and welcome to this week's episode of Inside Property Development with Henry Bliss from Give My View, part of Landtech. Hello, mate.
Nice to meet you. Nice to be here.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
But for those that don't, perhaps you give us a little intro, starting with Built ID and how that started, and then we'll get on to what you do now and why that's good for property developers.
Sure thing. So I guess just before I go into the background, so I'm client services lead at Give My View, which is part of Landtech. But previously I was at a company called Built ID, which was then acquired, but we'll go into that. And I joined there in 2019. Before that, I was in communications. So I worked in advertising for a number of years, a big creative advertiser, so making TV ads, etc. And I got a bit disillusioned, essentially, I would say, by making ads that for products that I probably wouldn't sell to a friend. And I just thought I want to do something a bit different. I want to use my skills, I guess, I picked up from learning how to communicate with people, or not necessarily me communicating, but creating things that could communicate well. A recruiter put through a number of different things, and I'd spotted the Built ID role, which was a startup. A social value-led prop tech company that was run by a very quite small team in London. And I went to meet them and thought, this is completely different to what I was going to do before, but I kind of can get behind this. I feel like probably that it was something was worthwhile, if that makes sense. So I joined there in 2019, as I said, and their communication platform or consultation platform, Give My View, had just launched. So pre-COVID, and I joined there as an account director, which was essentially to be in relation with our customers and clients and making sure that they had everything they needed.
That was the sort of evolution of something else, wasn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it was.
With those guys.
So to give you some background, so Built ID, I think, was founded in 2015 by Savannah de Savary, and Sav has been working with the company up until acquisition last year at Landtech. And the original idea was a product called Built Ideas, hence Built ID. And essentially, very quickly, I guess, in summation, is that it's a database of buildings. So people could go on, search different databases, see case studies of what was on there, who built the building, who designed it, what consultants worked on it. A very simple way, a layperson way of saying it is probably a Shazam, but for buildings rather than for music.
Yeah.
That's what the team were working on for a number of years. And they got a lot of uptake, but not actually much like sales and actual monetary value. It wasn't monetized really. So off the back of meeting with central government planners, Savannah got an inkling of some frustration from those planners and thought, hold on a minute, something I can do here. And that's how Give My View was born, which is why I'm here really to talk about, and I can cover it off in more detail in a second.
Okay. So tell me more about that then.
So as I said, Give My View came around way before COVID. So it was well before the need to digitize things because we were set up at home. And very simply put, it's a way of surveying questions online, but we call it a communications or consultation platform because it does a bit more than that. Everyone has online surveys and they can be very dull, and Give My View is kind of the antithesis of that. The challenge really is that, and I think this will resonate with everyone who potentially listens to this from a development point of view, is if you solely rely on traditional forms of consultation, whether that be in planning or for public sector, you're only going to really hear from a small proportion of a community. That proportion changes geographically, but predominantly it's from set ages, typically older. It's people who've got more time. They're probably people who have a certain level of income bracket, and therefore kind of they lead the narrative, the vocal minority.
Yeah.
And simply put, it's pretty mental that they're the ones that are consulted upon, give their opinion. Their opinions are fed into planning applications. It's pretty mental that their opinions are the only ones that are heard, and then something might go into planning submission or even approved and then be built, and only that proportion of a community have been listened to.
Yeah.
That's very a community first centric approach, but that kind of is probably where the idea came from.
Sometimes these things need a bit of translating, and I like to try to put it in a lay person's terms.
Good, so do we.
Typically what happens, or certainly used to happen, is you submit a planning application, and even if it's really good and people are probably going to like it, the people that like it don't say anything. They're all, and most of them, they're busy doing whatever. But of course, typically, and this is a bit of a generalization, although I've got to tell you, it is also a fact based on experience. Typically, the people that are more, perhaps older, more set in their ways, less in favour of any change at all, and of course typically have a lot more time on their hands. The vociferous minority, who are typically older, they're the ones that used to complain about everything. They're the ones that got listened to, because at the end of the day, politicians want to get voted in next time. And it was a nightmare, because, the people that liked stuff never said anything, and the people that didn't like it and probably wouldn't like anything said a lot, and they're the ones that got listened to.
Well, it's exactly why Give My View basically exists. So they dominate the narrative, and that is from if you're solely relying on traditional methods. So one thing I always caveat when we're speaking to potential new clients is that we're not here to downtrod those methods, because some of those conversations are invaluable, and you need to speak to those immediate neighbours in detail. So that still needs to happen, sometimes in probably just not reliance on it. What isn't happening is that majority of people who are silent aren't even probably aware that things are even happening. And there's a number of reasons for that. They are too busy. They don't have the time. They're not even being told about it, so they're not even educated about it. They probably feel like development is scary or something they don't understand, so they don't want to be a part of it. And because the system has been running for such a long time with them outside of the loop, it continues that way. That's the challenge. That's the issue. And our solution is to reach more people, bring them into the conversation in layperson's terms, as you were kind of mentioning just there, so that people can feel included. They can give their opinion, because they certainly care about where they live and their town or village and community. It's just they probably haven't had the chance to say so yet. What we do, and what Give My View does, is reach new community members, take it to them rather than asking them to come down to an event on a Tuesday night, or maybe log on to a webinar that's going to take an hour. Communicate to them in very simple terms, like you would speak to someone if you were sitting in a cafe or a pub and chat to them. Ask their opinion and take that back to developers, local authorities, renewable energy companies, housing associations, anyone who's trying to make a decision. So hopefully that can be taken on board and be better shape the plans. So essentially, Give My View's kind of tagline is it's built to make decision making easier, and it's for anyone who's making decisions and also the people who are inputting into those decisions, whether that be a community member on the street, on the phone, on their sofa, or actually a developer sitting at a planning meeting.
And I'm guessing, obviously you'll talk to people in a different way and ask them different questions at different stages, but I'm guessing it can be very, very early stages with we're thinking of doing something here. What sort of things would you like, or what do you like, at one end of the scale, to building up to, well, look, this is what we're planning on doing. What do you think about that?
Hit the nail on the head. So we are used on a huge, broad range of topics. So planning is our bread and butter, but we've always been quite proud of the fact that we're both public and private sector. So we're not always just seen as a developer's friend, although it is obviously good being a developer's friend, but it's helpful also doing stuff in public sector, because you're not just seen for building. You're actually policy making too. And we diversified into renewable energy, tenant satisfaction. Probably the most extreme is usage of a autism app, and speaking to the users there, whether they're carers or actually patients. So it's a very broad ranging what it does, essentially because it connects with anyone asking them questions in a normal way. We can be used at multiple stages in a process. Probably our ideal would be to be injected early. So you can basically find out what a community's preference is, priorities, concerns are early doors, and that info will then help a developer perhaps change a narrative of how they're going to take on that planning application. We realize that's not always in scope, because some projects are smaller, some projects are not going to last that long. So we can be used later on when you're putting plans to the community and saying, what do you think about these, or which elements of these are good? There's loads of different ways to cut it up, essentially. So I guess if I was trying to build out the ideal use, it will be a multi-phase approach where we can take people on a journey, or a community on a journey, and they can see from a developer's perspective, oh, they're listening to us. Yeah, they're taking this on board. And then going into planning, you'll then have supporters, because they say, right, okay, I get this. I didn't like this at the beginning, but they've listened to the community and this is what's going on. This is how they've taken it on. However, we realize that's not always the case. So that's why we keep things quite tangible. So if a developer is going in with a plan that's mostly fully formed, don't ask about density. Don't ask about height if you can't change it. What's the point? We're not here for a PR exercise. So focus on the different elements that a community could influence potentially, or you actually generally want feedback on. That's essentially so that people see that it's not just a PR exercise. So every project or license that we work with people on, we kind of come back to a few different elements or that we really impress on our clients and customers. And it should be one of all of these three things if possible. One, everything should be easy. So this is harking back to this decision-making easier line. That's kind of a marketing line, but it really is the DNA that's built into everything we do. So that should be easy for that developer to work with us, but actually it should be very easy for a community member to engage. So just briefly, it's not an app, for example, because an app would mean you have to download it. And that's a barrier to entry, that's a hurdle. So it's browser-based. So it's basically a click of a button on any device, you can get to it. It should be easy for a developer to actually input the questions and then get that data back. And it should be visual when they do so.
Before you go on, but I'm guessing a big part of what you do, I'm assuming, is like you obviously formulate the questions and...
Well, yeah, so taking a step back, I guess, because we haven't necessarily gone through the full chain. But when I joined Built ID, we were quite a small team, and quite naturally, we kind of took a consultative approach. So we were brought onto projects, some kind of different scales. So we worked with like very big house builders and then some smaller projects, but we were essentially a consultant managing Give My View on our client's behalf. And that's where we were formulating the customers' teams, formulated questions, built it all, and then kind of delivered it to them. Since then, we've kind of transitioned more to a self-service model for a number of different reasons. One, it's easier to be scalable. As projects grow, and if you're doing all consultancy, our team would just need to keep multiplying. Also because we are the experts in Give My View and how to get the information back from customers, but we're not the experts in planning and we're not the experts in development. So we can be instead kind of the engagement angel, if you like, on the shoulders of developers going, hold on a minute, you're talking quite technically there. Like, why don't you flip that so it's a bit more easy to understand for someone on the street? So that's the model that we work in now, where we're giving access to Give My View to all of our customers so they can go in, they can build the surveys because it's very easy to do. But we don't just step away like other software companies. We're actually there still to make sure that they're getting the most from it as they possibly could do. So when they're formulating questions, we are working with them, reviewing it, giving our view on how to optimize questions, for example, get more from the community. And then there's the end client, actual customer, eventually has the say of what they go live with. We're supporting, but we're not actually taking the lead, if that makes sense.
Interesting. I've got one for you, which I might even use you on. Could be a little case study.
Okay.
This is true. I'm not just making this up, right? It is in the green belt, but it is contained on 3 sides by development.
Yep.
Yeah. So it should tick the box as being grey belt.
Yep.
And it's in a local authority that's got a big deficit in its 5-year housing land supply. So it's a lot going for it. And I've got what I think are some interesting ideas for having quite a sort of dense-ish scheme. It's not trying to pack it with loads of flats or anything like that. A really nice, slightly innovative, nature-led scheme, which I think and hope will be really good. And I can and will engage locally, but I'm literally at the stage of thinking, right, okay, what is the best way to do this? I don't want it to be standard housing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's going to be a bit denser than a normal standard housing site, but it's going to be much better, in my opinion. Well, not just in my opinion, it is going to be a lot better. Trust me, if it goes how I hope it's going to go. And I obviously do want to do it the right way. But of course, if I go and to start talking to people locally, I'm not going to do this, by the way, and say like, oh, look, I'm thinking about developing this site. What do you think? Right now, I know that would actually not be very clever, because most of them will probably say, well, we like it as it is. We think it should stay as a field, right? Which is not really a realistic option when we've got a massive housing problem.
It's not going to get anywhere.
And it's got to go somewhere, right? So first issue, and I think actually this is always an issue in this whole area, is to what extent you engage at a very, very early stage and how do you do it? Because you can't say, like I say, I wouldn't do this, and anyone that does do it says, what would you like, is mad, because I know from experience most people will say we don't want anything.
Yeah. It comes back to asking things that are tangible. So don't ask, do you want this here from the outset? Because people will say no, because of historic opposition to change, human nature, people are going to be on the back foot immediately. So don't ask that. One thing I haven't covered yet is all of this I've mentioned about give my view and why we exist and how we reach new people. So when I say we're reaching new people, we're really taking it to a new audience. That's the key thing. So we're getting new people engaging who don't typically engage. And what that actually translates into in black and white is more engagement. So it's thousands of people rather than just tens or even hundreds. Sometimes we have hundreds of people, but that's probably when the project's smaller. But we can engage with thousands and thousands if the project scope allows. If you imagine, if you were asked lots of open-ended questions and you had 2,000 people answer and you had 10 questions and they're all open-ended or qualitative, immediately you've then got a reams and reams of written data that is incredibly difficult to actually analyze and access. So most of what we do is quantitative. So that keeps things tangible. So you don't say, do you want this? You could do that if you really wanted to, but it's probably not the best way of doing things, because that's not your aim for people to say no and you go, oh, I'm going to turn around. You actually say, okay, if this was going to happen, what elements would be most important to you? So it can then control your narrative, maybe even control your design. But then, as I said, don't talk about density if that's not going to change. However, I'll come on to an example about density in a second, about how the viewpoint can be kind of skewed because of what you think people might say. And just on how we get all that increased levels of data, because you might go, yeah, sure, 95% on average of people that access Give My View do so on a phone. So we're talking about people who aren't logging on to something to review. We're catching them and getting their attention while they're on, essentially waiting on the platform, perhaps waiting for the kettle to boil, waiting for the kids to come out of school, maybe even between adverts on the sofa. So everything needs to look good on a small screen. So everything that's, when it's put together in Give My View, needs to be quite succinct, very visual, and feel kind of natural to a phone environment. So we're not really dilly-dallying, if that makes sense. So the experience is quite concise. And frankly, we've got to be really, I guess I'm really hammer home to our developers and anyone that we're working with, is that it's a privilege to really have their attention for that 5 minutes. This is someone who might have be working a hospital shift and they're just taking 5 minutes outside to have a breather, and then they go on their phone and they start answering. And I'll come on to how we target them in a second. So that's why it needs to be concise, needs to be very quick to go through. And coming on to those three things I mentioned before, it maybe even needs to be fun. So fun is probably a stretch, but what I mean is it's not a chore to be a part of this engagement. And that's how we get more people, so thousands. So coming back to what you were saying before about ask what is tangible. Because if you're asking things that are outside as tangible, one, people will see through it. It actually won't be useful data. And then ultimately you go, what's the point? Because if you can't use it in a planning application or you can't use it in policy, then it's just a waste of time and money.
So let's take my site again, jump back as a little bit of an example. So it's probably going to be about 40, 50, 60 homes, depending on density and design and stuff like that. Yeah. It's in a medium-sized town in Hertfordshire, on the outside. How do you decide who to engage with and how you do it?
Yeah, so this is a really key part, and it's probably, interestingly, it's one of the bits we talk about most because it's kind of foreign to developers and public authorities that we work with. It's kind of outside of their remit. And I guess the setup for this is if you spend, you, Paul, or anyone listening, they spend a great time working with consultant teams or teams in-house, building out a really interesting survey that's going to provide interesting data that's going to be very useful in a planning application. It's going to lead design and perhaps will be very motivating for someone to answer. But if not many people answer, what's the point? It's a bit of a waste of time. The good analogy, or I think it's a good analogy, is if you're preparing a birthday party for a family member and you forgot to send out the invites or the WhatsApp messages to all your friends. So on the night, it's you and your neighbour sitting there and the dance floor is empty. That will be a huge waste of time. So what we do for probably 9 out of 10 of our projects is we run digital marketing campaigns to promote client surveys to the local community. So the local community is defined on each project by who is in your catchment. So who do you want to speak to? Whether that be that town, maybe it's a couple of surrounding villages, because there might be people in those villages who are either passing through or potentially might want to live there. Through digital marketing channels, we can really, really specifically target those areas up to like postcodes or radius from site. And what that means is that anyone who's passing in that catchment area can receive an advert, traditionally on Facebook or Instagram, because they're the most cost-effective ways of doing so, but you can use other channels too. And what we do is call for their opinion. So people of X town in Hertfordshire, tell us what you think about a new development on the edge of this town. Here are some designs. Tell us what your priorities are. And we have a specific marketing team who do this every day, and they write the ads, produce the ads, and then send them out. So with a small marketing budget, which is part of like the Give My View quote, we can bring thousands of new eyeballs on those adverts. So raising awareness of your plans, educating people about them, and then also getting their view. So very briefly, how that kind of marketing funnel works is with a small amount of money, we can really get loads and loads of eyeballs on. So some schemes we do when it's in London, for example, or across a region, it's hundreds of thousands of people will see our adverts. I think the most we've been seen is probably 250,000, 500,000. And that obviously doesn't mean that 500,000 people are clicking, because it might not be relevant to them, or they're not interested at all, or they're passing through. But it allows us to at least get some of their attention, and we're competing against things like adverts from Zara or the holiday pictures from their friends. But so that's why it needs to be very specific to their region. So our ads are very specific for each project. They're not just generic. Otherwise, they'd be like wallpaper. And that's probably where some of my communications background helps. But those adverts then translate into clicks. So let's say we get 10,000 eyeballs on. That means that thousands of people will click. And then obviously that thousands of clicks translates into 1,000 voters, or maybe 800
let's
voters.
Stop there. Let's just jump back a bit. My little site, this one I'm talking about, is in Tring in Hertfordshire.
Okay, I know what you mean. Yeah.
Right. So are you telling me you could geographically target Tring?
Yeah.
You can narrow it down that much, yeah?
That's specifically. So the only people that will be getting adverts who have people who've been in Tring, are in Tring, or maybe have passed through in Tring. So you can do that to like the town limits. You could do a bit outside, because that's probably relevant as well. So it means that's who we're speaking to. So anyone who's clicking, firstly, if you think about it, no one's going to be clicking on an advert if they don't care about Tring. Why would they? So their interest is piqued. And then they're straight into answering questions. We don't bother with, welcome to our survey. It's brilliant that you're here, because we've literally seen that causes a huge drop off. If you do that at the beginning of a survey, which is kind of a natural thing to do, you think like we should welcome people just leave. Because what you need to remember is we're speaking to people who are incredibly busy. They're not normally involved in this process. We've got to keep their interest. So answering a Give My View survey is engaging. It's quick. It's visual. You get feedback on how you've answered compared to the rest of the community. And some of the words sometimes we use is it's been gamified. And in gamified, what it means is like you gather points as you answer questions. Yeah. So yeah, it's very, very specific. And we run different adverts that are different regions. So for example, an advert in Tring will look very different to an advert in North Scotland for a renewable energy project. We do them in different languages if need be. So whether that might be you need to translate into Bengali because of communities there, or for example, we work with lots of Welsh developers and public authorities. So obviously adverts in Welsh as well as in English. So that's making it as inclusive as possible. So we're really capturing those diverse corners of communities rather than just the people who will turn up on a Tuesday night.
I'm guessing in terms of pricing, the wider you target, the more it's going to cost.
Yeah,
right?
So there's two parts to like a price that we do and Give My View. One is for the software itself, and that scales dependent on the scope that people need or the size of their licenses. But for digital marketing, it's dependent on the brief. So for example, if a project is for Tring, it will be a certain amount. But if another one is for the coastline of Norfolk for a wind farm, offshore wind farm, that's going to be more because you've got a bigger geographical stretch and also potentially a bigger population. So for example, London is more expensive and Manchester and Bristol, Birmingham is more expensive than a rural population in Devon.
Obviously, I know you've got lots of different clients. You mentioned wind farms and renewables and all sorts of stuff. I'm a small developer, right? And now I'm probably only looking at a couple of projects a year, in terms of serious ones that I'm trying to, get through or work on. Yeah, I probably don't want to sign up for some ongoing license thing. Can you sort of do it on a project by project basis?
Yeah. So coming back to this, because I've also, from hearing from your past episodes, I've heard you mention, for example, bigger developers will do obviously is potentially different to smaller developers. And we don't want scale to be a barrier for people. We want everyone to be able to use Give My View. From one of the smallest sites recently was 12 units in one block, for example. And our existing client had used Give My View on a number of other projects and still warranted using it on this project for only 12 units because they still thought we can benefit from this. And that was great to see that they weren't feeling like we shouldn't do it just because it's small. And one of the ways we combat that is you can do single project pricing. So it can be specific to a project, but also that's that move to self-service I was talking about. You're not paying for our full time to manage something, which a small developer wouldn't want to do because of budgets. But what we can do is give a license just on that project. And also if it's small, that digital marketing budget is going to be a lot smaller as well. For developers already used Give My View before, they won't need training potentially, or they won't need less support from us. So the costs can come right down. The other thing to say is if a developer buys it rather than just on single project, but for, across 2 years for it, because they know they've got 5 projects across those 2 years, then we can give them economies of scale there. So we don't want scale to be a barrier to be able to utilize Give My View.
Quite a lot of smaller developers listen to this, and they are sort of part of my target demographic, really. People that I'm trying to help get things done better, quicker, more efficiently. And I know that a lot of them, it's harder for them. They got
1,000 different things to be doing.
Exactly. And I do know also there might be the temptation for them to think like, oh, it's only a small scheme. I can't get involved in that consultation stuff, communication stuff. I shouldn't get involved in all the rest of it. But I can tell them categorically they should. And in fact, it's crazy not to. Really. So even on a little scheme, hopefully they're doing good stuff. They're doing things the right way. They need to get that message to people. And if you are doing good stuff, you are doing it the right way, you should get support. If you don't look to gain that support, go looking for it, all you will get is the objections. And it's that sort of stuff that will, I've seen too many good schemes get booted out just as a result of objections.
One thing I haven't covered yet, probably just from trying to say all different things at one time, but alongside that scale of numbers. So for example, a small developer listening to this might go, I don't need to speak to 1,000 people. That's fine. You don't have to if you don't need to, for example. You can scale it right back. If it's a much smaller development in a smaller rural area or smaller village, you don't need to speak to 1,000 people. We won't do that. But what it actually means is that you're speaking to the kind of, I go back to it, that silent majority. So people who aren't against change, people who aren't, to use the term that everyone uses, NIMBYs necessarily. They're probably people in the middle who'll go, this sounds all right. And then off the back of that, you can then follow up if they've given you personal information, for example, with further project updates, and they can learn more. You can even retarget them for planning submission as well if they've turned into supporters. So it's kind of full circle in that sense. But essentially, across the board, very, very, very rarely do we not get a more balanced view than if you just spoke to people who would typically engage. One example I mentioned before is about density that it made me think of it when you mentioned it for your project in Tring. We were working in a London borough, and in one phase of consultation, people who were doing the consultation asked community to rank their preferences on a certain scheme. One of the elements that came third, I think, in the list at the time was density and height. The people we were working with were so unsure. They said that they're like, really? Like, really? And then, so they basically, on the next round of consultation, because they were running more than one, asked it again, like, are you sure you meant this? Because we were so astonished. And basically the community was saying, if it's high, then it might mean we can afford it. So we might be able to live there. And that was essentially because we tapped into a different community than you would typically get from the homeowners in the area. So basically people who are renters saying, well, the chance of me maybe getting a place in that flat or maybe even purchasing that flat would be awesome. So it kind of flipped it completely on its head. The same thing happens in renewable projects where clients are like very worried about particular like elements of safety or maybe fire, and they say fire is going to be a real issue here. Well, it's not an issue for us, but we think the community are very worried about it. And then we actually go out and the mentions of fire are tiny. Everyone else is talking about the need for to kind of protect against climate action, and maybe providing new renewable energies in the area will be a good thing. It really does change the narrative. And I guess that's the thing that small developers would miss out on if they don't go out to the community, is changing and perhaps being proactive in the narrative. Because if you're a bit passive, I guess is the way to say it, then it might just be that dominant people in your neighborhood who are waving the flags, and you go into a planning application completely on the back foot.
That almost certainly is what happens if you don't go to find supporters, because I like to think that I only do good stuff.
If you only speak to a certain proportion of people, they'll not like it.
So, I remember one scheme specifically in Acton in West London, right? So it's quite a dense-ish, built up, a lot of Victorian houses, quite nice Victorian houses. It was an old furniture factory, rusty corrugated building, pissing off everyone for years. Lorries coming, going, all hours, because it was just there for historic reasons. It would never get permission to be there, anymore, but it's just been there forever, yeah? Noise, fumes, traffic, annoying everyone for years and years, including this 5-story high, just under, building right on the rear boundary of these quite nice high-value houses, right? Everyone been complaining about it for years. What I think was a really good scheme, actually. Submitted a planning application. Everyone went absolute. I mean, this was years ago before I knew any better, yeah? Everyone went ballistic, complaints, objections, placards down at the town hall, etc. Got refused, won it at appeal. After I built it, everyone loved it.
Yeah, well...
That's
probably a typical story. That's the sad thing. People didn't like it originally. And this is also is a view, but the people who didn't like it were the people who just were against change. What you didn't hear from is anyone who didn't know about your application, who was probably interested in living in the area in a new modern building. So that voice was completely silent, as I've mentioned already. So what it meant was you eventually did get planning, but it took time, it took extra money, and that's what we're Give My View can avoid. It's about smoothing out the process for everyone involved. We're obviously very, as I kind of mentioned, we like being public and private, but we are very much developers' friends. But we're quite community first in how we've built everything. Everything is to work for the layperson, so they understand it. That's why we removed the ability for people to have like too long text, because we know that's what developers would want to do. But we know it won't work with communities. We know it will turn them off. If you lose someone in interest, they're never going to come back. So that's why we keep things very succinct. And there's lots of behavioral psychology in how we ask things. And that behavioral psychology translates into more engagement and better data, essentially. I mentioned that we're not necessarily the experts I'm certainly not the expert in planning or property development, but we are the communications experts. And what that comes back to is, I guess, optimizing the consultation.
You mentioned that you're not the planning experts and you're not really consultants.
Not anymore.
So how do you formulate your questions?
Give My View is a tool for people. It's a tool to connect with more community members than you would ever get before. And we realized that everyone has 1,000 different things to think about when they're putting in planning applications. And we're a small section of that. So everything needs to be as easy as possible. And that comes back to the functionality of Give My View. And we want to slot into people's processes as much as possible. We realize bigger developers will already have planning consultants involved. So we don't want to step on their toes. We don't want to step in PR consultants' political toes. We're not there for that. But we are there to provide people with the option to gather a lot more data that's more balanced quickly. They can be slotted into planning applications. Formulating the questions, we can operate a couple of ways. When you work with someone more than once, typically they know what they want to ask and they're great at it. And so that second time round or third time round working with someone at the outset, sometimes it's really funny. Some people come to us and they go, and they've already bought the software, they're ready to go, and they go, what should we ask? And you think you don't know what you want to ask at all. So we work with them to kind of draw out what is a few different things. One, what would be useful for perhaps even the architects, the landscape architects, the transport consultants? What would be motivating for the community to actually answer? Because if it's not motivating, why will people ever do it? And what's actually feasible or tangible? Because otherwise, what's the point? People would see through it. So we can do that in a number of ways. One, asking them to kind of get a start of a 10. What do you actually want to find out from the community in trading pool? So you can jot some notes down and we will help formulate it in a structure and a narrative that educates people, but also gets you good data. Or the other way, if we really need to, we can get a full client group together and do a workshop. So that will be project managers, developers, a range of consultants, the ones I've already mentioned, and get everyone to feed in different aspects of what they think a community might be interested in answering that's in scope. So that's where they can clearly say, don't ask about this because we're never going to change it. From very small elements to really big elements. And what we do when we do those workshops, which don't always need to do because sometimes lots of people know what they want to ask, is we ask them to come at it from a community persona rather than doing it as a developer. So we say, developers, put your everyday hat onto one side. You're going to be a married couple who've lived in Tring for 30 years. We want your thoughts on the development. And it allows the project team, I guess, to step outside of their day jobs and come at it from a community angle. And it just flips everything. So when they are starting to put the questions together, they've already got their community head on, probably a lot more than they would have ever done in another way. As I said, it's not always going to spit out a perfect survey, but it allows the project team to kind of come together and kind of get those reoccurring themes. So you come out off the back of that session going, okay, right, it's the landscaping that's the thing here because nothing else is really in scope.
Have you got like a load of, almost like a drop down of a load of pre-selected questions that you could choose? Because it's interesting actually. I was thinking of it as you were saying it, as a developer. Now I know what I think's good and what I don't want to do things that would be bad for a place or a community. But I don't know how people locally think. And I've got to say, the amount of times I've done stuff and you get into it and then you discover stuff you just didn't know or realise. But to have like a big long list of stuff that's come up in the past, I think would be really a useful way of thinking, oh, well, actually, that's a good question. I hadn't thought of that,
It sounds like we've set it up. I promise we haven't, but we have a library of questions that people can access. So we've got a question library and they can be broken down by themes. So if you're working on a project that has build to rent, for example, there is a build to rent set of questions that you can look up, review with a click of a button, add to your survey, and then edit as needed, put in your new images.
You can put images and things in this
stuff
as well.
Actually, I guess because we're mostly, we're audio and visual today, but I'm not actually showing anything, but obviously we can link to some things. Give My View is visual all the way through. So basically, wherever possible, we're always offering visual cues to questions. And this, I mentioned this at the beginning, but simply put, because online surveys can be very, very dull. We've all done this. We don't want to be like that. It's the idea of coming away, and I mentioned trying to be fun. You don't want to come away from one of our interactions and go, oh, that was negative, that was boring, because that essentially has an effect on their relationship with that developer. It wants to be a positive engagement. So you feel like, that was even like enjoyable to do. You can have visual references, what will you mean? You can show videos in your questions. You can show carousels of images, pinch and zooms. We don't ask questions like, do you strongly advise or do you strongly agree, slightly disagree? Because that's just essentially what it's research questions. It's nonsense to someone on the street. So we ask how people feel about something and they can react with like emoji scales if need be, because that's just a bit like Instagram stories. They're very used to doing that on a phone. While they answer with an emoji face, you actually get data points on sentiment scores. So you can actually quantify how many people are neutral, positive, or negative towards something. And that's all about how we get more engagement. So we don't do it in a typical way. So when you're writing those questions, that's where we're there on your shoulder going, pull your arse in this like a typical online survey. Let's flip that and make sure it's more engaging. And that's what our role is, kind of the engagement specialist on your shoulder is all about.
So I'm liking it already.
Good.
Even now you've explained it, because it's so interesting. I know what other people would have been thinking. I'm sort of like, I had been imagining a bit more like normal survey questions and blah, 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 which are boring, aren't they?
Yeah, so they really are. And that's why I mentioned there's loads of behavioral psychology. So like some very small bits. I mentioned the sliders and the slightly agree type questions, but we have lots of multiple choice, as you can probably imagine, but those have images in. And one thing we really noticed is when you have an odd number of options on our screen, so we basically show them in pairs. So as you can imagine, it needs to look good on a phone. So we have pairs. If you have 6 options, it's A, B, C, D, E, F. And if you have 5 or 7 options, basically one will be at the bottom by itself, if you can picture that. And what we notice is the human brain is very lazy. And because it was by itself, people wouldn't choose it as much. And we statistically saw that it was creating a swing. So we removed the option to have that because we don't want any bias to be in the questions.
Yeah.
And for another simple reason, there's no set order to multiple choice questions. They randomize, for example, so there can be no skew for having options at the top. We also recognize IP addresses so that community members can't try and answer 10 times, for example, to try and skew results, because we'll recognize that they've already answered it, so that people can only answer the questions that they haven't done so far. We also allow people to skip, because if you require someone to answer a question, they'll either answer it or they'll go, "Oh, that's not for me," and shut their phone, and then you've lost them. And you've lost them because you wanted them to give you your email or something, and that's just a barrier to entry. So there's loads of ways to harness tech and community input, but it can be done wrong. Don't just think because I'm doing something online means it's going to be right. It's a bit like if you prepared boards for a community consultation that you were using on face-to-face, and you just put them up online. That's a different medium. It's a different forum. It doesn't work that way. So you need to kind of tweak it to make it work best online. And that's the frustrating thing I see, is because I see sometimes when people have done something like that and you think that costs money. And it's just a waste of time necessarily, because you're not really harnessing new opinions and differing opinions, and not really giving the people the chance to. I could talk about that kind of stuff forever. So there's loads of other elements of behavioral psychology, but we don't really dwell on it. One thing that our founder, Savannah, was really keen on is, and it's a really interesting side of things, is that they call it the IKEA effect. And it's essentially people have a greater connection to things that they help build. And that translates into public engagement and sometimes development. Is if someone was part of a community consultation where they're helping shape the plans, however small, they feel more positive towards it as it moves towards submission. And that's what that kind of give my view summary is. If you can give people elements to influence, however small, or maybe input, and you take them on that journey, they're going to be more positive towards at the end. And we've had examples of that in the past where developers have come back and said, actually, that planning submission was one of the smoothest I've ever done. And it was because they took a multi-phase approach. That project was big, for example, the one I'm referencing there, it was a regeneration of Milton Keynes. And that allowed the scope for those multiple phases. And I realized not every project will, but reaching out to community at the beginning, when there's things up for scope, or at least you're just kind of raising awareness, can only have a good effect.
Yeah.
If you ask the questions in the right way.
The results you can form part of your planning application.
Yeah, great question. We haven't even touched on that. So coming back to the ease, everything is available immediately on Give My View. So you can see the results very quickly. Because most of it's quantitative, it's actually very visual. So it doesn't come just as X's and O's. You can obviously download it as that if you want to. But on the back end, you can see what community is saying with the percentages, numbers of people, even with the images at which they answer the questions. You can screenshot that immediately, send it to colleagues, put it into presentations. You can download it in PDFs. You can segment the data by different ages of respondents, by relationships. So basically, if someone lived in this village compared to the other village, you can see what people are saying. And then obviously that can go into planning applications, whether that's in an SCI or actually fed back into design if it's at that early stage. So then you can go into planning meetings and going, look, we've spoken to 800 people and 75% of people are saying this is what they want, for example. So it's, by keeping most things quantitative, it's easily translatable into like clear data that can be actioned. Of course, the qual is still very useful, and we definitely encourage people to do that. And that's where you might get detailed feedback about a number of different things, but it could even be ideas. It's not always people being negative. It's like someone saying, this would be brilliant. Have you thought about this? And generally, when we get qualitative, that's when we encourage our users to ask for personal information at that point, so that I could have put your email pool in relation to that comment, and you go, oh, that's really interesting. Or maybe it's you shared a concern that we can actually go, oh no, don't worry, we've thought about that. So the developer has that contact detail to contact that person. You can perhaps turn them from someone who's negative into someone going, okay, that's fine.
Local authorities work for any of those?
Yeah, loads.
Really?
So that's the thing, I guess, for me personally, it's been really interesting across the years is for 5 years I've been working with Give My View, and now leading the team within the Give My View team within Landtech. It's not the same. We work across loads of different things. As I said, it's like renewable projects off the coast of Norfolk or in the Scottish Highlands or the Welsh Mountains, to local plan consultation in London, to placemaking in Wales, female safety across London boroughs, regeneration of council housing in Runnymede. It really does kind of swing. In local authorities are obviously encouraged to do loads of consultation, and it's across the board. So there, it's like the scope is really endless. I guess the barrier for us there is procurement. It's not always easy, but we're on G Cloud now, for example, so we're easy to procure that way. And there's lots of movement going forward with prop tech funds and innovation to encourage more engagement there, which we've been a part of, actually. We've been great to be working with. You mentioned Hertfordshire. We've done quite a lot of work with Southwest Hertfordshire, which is a combination of councils, as part of their local plan. So that was engaging across, I think we had on 2 rounds of engagement, we had about 4,000 people engaged on each round. So the volume of data there was massive about people showing what they want for the future of their area. Our actually record project was a local plan consultation in Ealing that gained over 10,000 voters, which really did blow the doors off it. So the level of data we provided to the council there, or we were able to provide to the council there, was so different to what they'd done previously, which was all written letters, etc. So the planners there were kind of astounded. And it was even the first project we did with Ealing. So it was kind of great to start it off so well.
I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but in terms of the cost, right? Let's jump back to my one. Tring, little site, 40, 50 homes, not a massive place. So targeting Tring and the immediate surrounds.
Yeah, local villages potentially around Tring.
Yeah,
or not even that further away than that.
Parking the fact that I'm part of Landtech and you're going to do me a deal.
Yeah, sure.
Assuming I was the normal person, what was something like that cost?
So we're there talking a single project pricing, which is we offer because we know it's an intro for people, and we know that people like to try us. But that's kind of a key thing, especially over these 5 years that we've found, is that once people use us, they come back because they see their benefit and they do it over and over again. And that's part of me and my team's kind of support level. I guess I know, not sounding like I'm answering a question, but that's something we want to do, is we want to hook you in and offer that, because otherwise we offer bigger licenses and multi-use licenses. Yeah. But so there's 2 parts to a cost. One is the license, which covers the training, support, reporting, if you want us to. So there's a bit of fluctuation there because you might want more users, you might want some extra reporting from us, or you might just want to take the data yourself. And the second half is the digital marketing. Digital marketing on that, let's say it's not going to cost you too much. Depends on the level, but the ones you're talking about, I would say if you give me £2,000 for digital marketing, that'll be enough to reach hundreds of people, maybe even more around Tring. So really reaching that kind of new audience that won't engage if you did normal standard only consultation. And a license, it will fluctuate, but let's say around 5,000 to kind of get you on board there. And that will give you enough, I guess, as a rounded full package.
So ballparky, I'm sure people will be wondering, let's just say starting off with a sort of small scheme, what would this sort of stuff cost?
I guess things fluctuate on scale, really. So a very small scheme, one of the ones we mentioned that was lower levels where you don't need to target very much, we're starting at maybe a couple of £1,000s. Things fluctuate on that, so there's different scope that changes and it can rise and fall. But then larger schemes that require multiple rounds of consultation, wider targeting, that's where things can get more expensive. But bringing bigger value back for the multiple rounds of consultation. So yeah, that's the starter point.
So even if I was just doing one project, I'd still need to buy a license.
Yeah, that's just essentially how we structure things. So licenses essentially means for you to use the software. The beauty is, though, typically we offer 12-month licenses. So you're paying that one-off cost, but it means that you can utilize Give My View across a year. You can do as many different surveys as you want. If you're going into local areas and you want to build a survey that's bespoke to that event, you can build a survey for free and take it with you there. So basically what you're buying there is access to Give My View for a year for that project.
I like it. And, without a doubt, as a developer, neutralising the objectors, encouraging support is really a massively important thing. Because even, I've got to tell you, I think it's basically a bit of an insurance policy, if nothing else. Because, as I say, the amount of schemes I see that are actually good, that actually get booted out.
They don't get the chance to be heard.
Just because of the level of objection. And there are some local authorities where it is as simple as, depending on how many objections you get, depends on the chances that you're going to get refused or not, even if it's a good scheme.
And that's the problem with, I guess, the way the system has been working for a very long time.
Yeah.
We haven't really touched on this bit, but this is the element where if you're sitting in a meeting and you go, right, okay, there's 50 objections here, having the data to go, okay, those 50 of people have written in because they're passionately negative. But actually, we've spoken to another 600 people. And in those 600 people, there are negative people, of course. Those 50 people that probably objected will be within those 600 because, of course, they're interested and they've answered. But there's 80% of the rest of the people saying, this sounds all right. Or even 30% within that saying, this sounds really good. It changes the context of what councillors are looking at. And actually, it's becoming more and more difficult for them to turn their eye away from Oh, okay. So it's just, I guess I'm coming back to it's stopping the objectives from leading the narrative and kind of having that vocal minority shout the loudest, which we just don't think is fair. Going back to what we said at the beginning, is it shouldn't be done that way. Everyone should be able to be heard, and that's what Give My View is. It's trying to democratize things as much as possible.
Lovely. Okay, mate. Well, that sounds like a place to wrap it up.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, mate. Thanks for tuning in to Inside Property Development. Please remember to like and subscribe. Do join us every week where we'll be speaking to house builders, developers, experts, planners, and everyone involved in trying to get more much needed housing created the right way. We'll learn together how we can collaborate rather than fight, and by working together, we can all help create better places, spaces and homes and a much more beautiful world.